Welcome to the Semi-Retired Podcast with your host, Richard Bonomo.
And me, Dave Farrant. Richard, how was your week? Anything unusual happen?
I had to go get fingerprinted. Nothing criminal, just had to get fingerprinted. Which kind of set the tone in terms of, how can I put it, darkness after doing the research for this week's topic.
This week's topic, which is none other than Mr. Edward Bernays. Like the Bernays sauce, I guess, that we have with certain foods, although spelled differently, and you can all see that on the banner that's announcing this show. Edward Bernays, a man whose name is probably not known to you or to most people, certainly wasn't to me until I was in my mid-40s or something, maybe into my 50s. And recently, Richard and I have been talking about him and decided that he was worthy of a podcast. So who is Edward Bernays? Or rather, let's start with who was Edward Bernays' uncle. Richard?
So Edward Bernays' uncle twice over is Sigmund Freud, the man who thinks everything is a cigar.
Mr. Phallus Giganticus. Well, I shouldn't say that. Probably overcompensating. So Sigmund Freud was the founder of psychoanalysis, born in 1856 and died in 1939. A figure that we were talking about this earlier, I've been aware of probably since the days of the Bugs Bunny cartoons, because I know there was like the European sounding psychiatrist in there smoking a cigar. That image is kind of cooked into the zeitgeist or the popular culture. I don't know much about him other than that. I have a quote here from him that sets the tone to some extent for what we're going to talk about with Mr. Bernays. And this quote from Sigmund Freud is that most people do not really want freedom because freedom involves responsibility. And most people are frightened of responsibility. End quote. True or not, I don't know, but thus said Sigmund, probably in the 1880s or 1890s.
A very upbeat, light guy. You want him at the parties bantering? Hey, how you doing? Nobody wants responsibility.
Yeah.
He came to the conclusion that man is an irrational beast and needs to rein that in and learn a way to become a rational, functional member of society.
What took place on the Western Front between 1914 and 1918 shocked a lot of people in European society, that seemingly modern peoples, the English peoples, the French peoples, the Germans, could descend to that kind of barbarity. Give you a sense of scale for people who aren't familiar. There was a large battle on the Western Front. It started in July of 1916. The English army tried to break through the German lines at the Somme, which is a river, and they lost 60,000 men before noon that day. By comparison, the American army lost 54,000 people over 10 years in Vietnam. And think of the impact of Vietnam on that country and in our memories, 60,000 on one morning. My grandfather was actually on the Western Front, on my mother's side in the First War, didn't fight, drove a truck, drove ammunition to the front, drove the wounded back. It was obviously an enormous event, and a lot of people drew conclusions from it, including, as Richard pointed out, our friend Sigmund Freud and his contemporaries. So his nephew, Edward Bernays, to bring us to our subject of today's podcast, had moved to the United States from Austria, where he grew up.
When he was a year old.
So he comes to America with his family. By the time World War I rolls around, he is employed by then President Woodrow Wilson to be a member of something called the Committee on Public Information that Woodrow Wilson set up to help convince the American public, which was staunchly anti-war and isolationist at this point, that it was a good idea for America to get involved in the war because, frankly, the Allies were losing on the Western Front. And they needed America's help, but the American population was really not inclined to favor such an adventure, they would have called it.
Especially since it's not in their backyard.
Not in their backyard, absolutely. Yeah. And why should they send their boys, put their blood and treasure on the Western Front? So Wilson convenes this group of young guys, I guess they were young, I don't know, thinkers, including Bernays, and they start to work on what came to be called at that time propaganda. Before propaganda's reputation was besmirched by someone a few decades later, but we won't get there yet.
He's like 24, 27 at the time.
You're right, he's a young man. He's a young man. Presumably he studied psychology of some point, psychoanalysis in his uncle's footsteps. These guys, and I keep saying guys, I don't say that to exclude women from this conversation, but I'll bet it was all guys at that point, set out to change the minds of the American public. They did things like they sent people they called them Minutemen into movie theaters, and they would stand up before the movie started and deliver an anti-German pro-war message, and then the movie would run. They were successful.
Dave, are you saying this is the first influencer campaign?
I think you could easily call this the first influencer campaign. They got articles placed in newspapers. Again, these are common tactics today, but they weren't in 15 and 16, leading up to America's entry into the war in 1917. So they were hugely successful. America's wealth and the flower of its young men went to the Western Front. The Allies prevailed, as we know, And at the peace conference after the end of World War I, Edward Bernays, Eddie as his friends called him later, was invited to join President Wilson. And Richard will pick up the narrative of what happened over there as Wilson was feted as the man who would save democracy.
As he's watching the people in adulation for Wilson at this conference, Bernays starts to realize, look what we did with propaganda during the war. I wonder if I can apply these techniques that we developed during the war, the propaganda, which he would later rename famously public relations.
That's right.
During peacetime. How can we use these techniques to influence the public to buy more goods? Maybe I could put this to work for the corporations.
And so Edward, with that thought and that idea, returned to the United States and, as Richard mentioned, became the father of public relations, as he is called now, and started to put his dark arts to work on various projects, including a famous one for the American Tobacco Growers Association. Richard's going to take you through what Eddie did for the American Tobacco Growers Association with respect to women.
So the American Tobacco Association wanted to sell more cigarettes, and they realized that there was a whole untapped market of women. But it was considered taboo for women to smoke at that time in the early 20s. So he devised a campaign where he got some of the suffragettes to appear at an Easter parade. This was very well directed.
In New York City, I believe.
In New York City. It was repeated later on in other cities. But
yes.
he directed them, okay, at a certain point, when I give you the signal, you're all going to pull out your cigarettes and you're going to light up. At the same time, he snuck the word out to all the newspapers he knew, who sent their photographers, knowing when Bernays gives the signal, snap the photo. And so he started a campaign. He even fed them the line, Torches of Freedom.
Torches of Freedom. So the cigarettes that these young debutantes lit up were called Torches of Freedom. Bernays connected the idea of the torch, if you think of the Statue of Liberty, with the women's burgeoning sense of freedom that had been lit during the suffragette movement and now came to full fruition or fuller fruition because they started smoking.
The beauty of it was you couldn't tell them not to smoke because you were taking away their freedom.
Yes.
It was like this perfect thing. You got to sell cigarettes and the women were empowered. And I'm saying this empowered. He regretted this later on, his work with the tobacco industry.
Oh, did he? Yeah,
he did.
I didn't know that, yeah.
There's stories also that he tried to get his wife to quit smoking. He saw the dangers of it even as he was promoting it. They were aware very early on of the dangers of cigarette smoking. The only thing I ever found in researching that he felt guilty for doing was for inducing women to smoke.
I've not detected any sense of remorse or guilt associated with any of the man's work or campaign, so that's a new one on me. Let us not forget, wasn't there something that Uncle Sigmund would have found symbolic about the cigarette?
They were considered penises. By men having them, it showed their strength, their power. Give women a penis, they'll feel more powerful.
I see. So the small, rigid paper cylinder full of tobacco stood in for the penis.
Apparently.
Well, what do you know, eh?
Yeah, what do you know? Symbolism.
What an exciting decade the 20s must have been. The roaring 20s.
Yeah, the start of the mass manipulation is starting right here.
Well, yeah, that is what's happening. We're kidding around a bit here, but Richard's exactly correct. This is the beginning of mass manipulation. Edward Bernays begins to have these successes. At the same time, there's a writer, reporter, and political commentator called Walter Lippmann, P-N, who's active at this time, who wrote a book called On Public Opinion. A quote from Lippmann refers to the public, us, you, me, everybody you know, as a bewildered herd that needs to be carefully controlled by specialized, deserving elites who run things. In this case, that would be people like Edward Bernays and the type of messaging he's putting out through his new public relations industry. This loops back to Sigmund Freud, this sense that there's an evil, repressed character inside everybody that can bubble to the surface like it did in the First World War, and the elites in any society need to control this. It's like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde idea. Need to somehow control that. And they began to see public relations as not just a way to sell products like cigarettes and other things to people, but a way to control the way people think. We're talking about, put bluntly, thought control in a democratic society. And this is not a conspiracy theory.
No. I'll just read this quote here from Edward Bernays. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country.
Let that one sink in, peeps.
It bookends beautifully with what Lippmann said.
Yes.
And essentially becomes the philosophy of the governments at this point. When we think of the conspiracy theories, the Illuminati, and this kind of stuff, you're like, I wonder where they got the idea from when you see that quote. It almost makes sense. It almost makes you want to open that door and go, is there a triangle-headed monster in here?
Yeah, where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a quote from somebody else that I'm not going to try and quote it, but the point of it was that democratic governments in the wake of World War I, which is when a lot of the European monarchies had fallen and were replaced by democratic governments, realized that they could no longer control their populations when they needed to do so by using clubs and batons. That era had passed. So they were hungry for new ideas, and the ideas coming out of the Committee on Public Relations, which we've talked about, and are now morphing through society in terms of consumer behavior, and quotes like the one Richard just made by Bernays and the one I gave from Lippmann, supplied governments with Plan B. We will replace the baton with thought control.
A much more nefarious plan because it went pretty much unseen for decades until people started unraveling this.
Yeah, it's supposed to be unseen. That's the whole thing, right?
Well, that's what it says here, the invisible hand.
The invisible hand, thank you. The invisible hand.
Yeah. Guiding us along. So Bernays is working with a lot of the corporations at this time.
Oh, he becomes extremely popular. You mentioned the cigarettes campaign. Another of Bernays' campaigns created the bacon and eggs breakfast, which we take for granted. Before Bernays came along and he was contacted by whatever organization wanted to sell more pork, and they said, Mr. Bernays, people buy chicken and beef for dinner. They don't buy pork. What do we do? And Edward took a look at the problem and came back and said, okay, we're going to sell pork to people at breakfast because people in North America were eating a very light continental style breakfast. So what did Bernays do? He contacted a whole bunch of doctors across the U.S. and got them to give him information that suggested that people should start their day with a big hearty breakfast to give them energy. And what better food to eat during this hearty breakfast would be bacon and eggs. So the next time you sit down to bacon and eggs breakfast, think of Edward Bernays.
And no doubt he had the egg producers in his pocket too, right?
100%.
Because he was notorious for this. He would propose a campaign and all the parts of the campaign were partners that he had business dealings with. So he'd say, I think you need to sell bacon. You know what goes good with bacon? Eggs. I have a guy at the egg place who can help you out. He had his hands everywhere. He had tentacles in all the companies. They had him on retainer. And so they knew when we get him, we're not just getting him, we're getting his partners who are going to help us sell the product too. So it was beneficial for everybody.
He became extremely successful. He had a beautiful apartment overlooking Central Park. Politicians, celebrities, socialites would come to Edward Bernays' apartment. He was, in fact, a celebrity because of his proven ability to manipulate people's behavior. And again, we won't get there quite yet, but news of Edward's success drifted across the Atlantic and landed on some very unpleasant ears over there. I want to throw out one more campaign just before we move on. It was for Dixie cups.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure if this is in the 20s or later. Edward's contacted by the Dixie Cup Company or whoever makes Dixie cups, and they want to sell more Dixie cups. So his campaign focused on convincing people that glasses made out of glass were unsanitary, and he used images of genitalia and venereal disease to get his point across.
As if the glass would contain remnants of this on its surface.
Yeah, like people were rubbing their beer glasses on their crotches or something. I mean, I don't know how that was supposed to work. The man's scruples were not really that powerful.
And the Dixie cup was a disposable kind of thing. It was a one-use thing. It came to your mouth clean. The next time you drank clean again.
That was the idea, right? So yeah,
filthy heathens
waste their time like I'm doing right now with this lovely water glass that I'm enjoying some water from. Wouldn't have been to Edward's taste.
No, that's for heathens.
So there he is in the 1920s enjoying tremendous success, and then the stock market crash comes around.
And the beauty of this is he was encouraging everybody to spend money. Spend. They were turning the nation of workers into a nation of consumers. So one of the things he encouraged people to buy in this age of consumerism was stocks. Go out, buy stocks.
The roaring 20s.
The stock market is fantastic. If you have to borrow money to buy stocks, then of course, infamously, 1929, the stock market crashed.
That was a big moment. Coming out of that, the world really, and certainly the US in particular, drifted into the Great Depression. One of the other impacts of his work in the 20s is that as companies became more and more excited by the results of his work, they wanted to move people, and Richard alluded to it a few minutes ago, from a culture of buying things you needed. Your shoes wore out, you bought a new pair of shoes. That's how people thought before. It's just the way it was. To no, not really. Maybe you need 5 or 6 pairs of shoes, stuff you want. The industries began to refer to us as consumers. We used to be citizens. Now we were consumers, which when you think about it, and this only occurred to me a couple of years ago, it's actually a pretty rotten thing to call people. It really turns us into just things that I just eat things, I drink things.
You're a mouth and a sphincter.
That's even worse than I thought. A mouth and a sphincter.
Always glad to bring the dark lining.
Well, speak for yourself, buddy. Yeah. Yeah, so there we are, a bunch of mouths and sphincters. Helping take America out of the Great Depression was the new president, Franklin Roosevelt, who wound up being elected 4 times, by the way. It's a record. He began his set of policies called the New Deal. And the New Deal was devised as a way to, and it meant a new deal of the cards, a way to set things right in America. The ideas of the New Deal were taken up in England as well, as the leaders of society sought a way to overcome the Great Depression. And it was a way of setting the economy straight. And it had the effect of democratizing societies from an economic perspective. The effects of the New Deal lasted until roughly 1980. We'll get to that later. But as the New Deal began to succeed more and more, Roosevelt's election in 1936, so his second term, was an enormous landslide. He was hated by the companies because they had been pushed to the side. Roosevelt was taxing them. He was taxing the wealthy, and they wanted to push back in the current parlance. And who better to help them than Mr. Edward Bernays? And so they started to work with him in terms of improving the image of big business. Again, this is in the American context, but no doubt was happening elsewhere. They wanted to improve their image. And so they wanted Edward to find ways to associate them, their products, whatever it was, cars, refrigerators, TVs, with progress and good times. As Edward was working for all these different corporations, and they talked about better living through science and how General Motors was going to transform America and life, Edward became the publicity director for the upcoming 1939 New York World's Fair, an event which I've always found fascinating, where they unveiled the Futurama. We were promised probably flying cars for the first time, like Richard and I talk about a lot. Edward, working on behalf of American industry in general, sought to turn that event into a showcase for American technology and business as part of business's overall push to regain the position of dominance they had had before the New Deal. But let's roll back a couple of years earlier. Sitting on the work table here in the Semi-Retired Studio is the copy of a book that spent a number of years on the bedside table of a very well-known European thinker of the 1930s, and that man is none other than
Joseph Goebbels,
the propaganda minister of the Third Reich, who was a big fan of Edward Bernays.
Big fan of Edward Bernays, a big fan of Roosevelt and the New Deal program, the way of getting the workers back to work after the stock market crash and the massive unemployment, social programs. But they saw it in a different way. We're going to get the workers back to work to build Germany up again. And he used the teachings in the book to begin what they called the cult of the Führer. And so he used those things to start whipping up crowds and organizing rallies where the Führer would come on and people would start losing their minds, and really tapped into that philosophy of the irrational.
And it should be said that Germany suffered from the Great Depression. It is speculated that had there not been a Great Depression, had there not been a stock market crash, rather, that the Nazis would not have come to power, because their early influence had waned. By the late 20s, Germany was recovering from its terrible hyperinflation and depression of the 1920s. When the stock market crash happened, a lot of American investors pulled their money from German companies. The German economy started to tank again, and the people were at that point more prepared to listen to Adolf Hitler and the other Nazi leaders with whom they had an acquaintance from their earlier campaigns. So everything starts to connect. And yes, Joseph Goebbels loved the book Propaganda.
So you see, he had influence on both sides of the ocean, obviously for very different purposes. Here it was to sell stuff, there it was to take over the world.
If we look at it in that regard, Bernays' work had the effect in the United States, not just of swaying public opinion in certain ways, but of selling products to the masses. Whereas in Europe, the effect was to help the evil purposes of the Nazi regime to eventually start World War II and commit genocide. To get back to something we said way up the top of this episode, you can look at Edward Bernays as one of the most influential figures of certainly the first half of the 20th century, a name that I was completely unfamiliar with, as was Richard. Maybe we just missed that day in class. I don't know. But for us, a fascinating man as a result of that. Coming out of the war, Bernays continues to be successful. Advertising as an activity, public relations as an activity, is increasing in popularity when we think of the 50s and the rise of youth culture and the cars and the clothes and the music. Edward was in a perfect position to continue to help corporations in ways that weren't always entirely above board, as Richard will demonstrate in the next story about the United Fruit Company.
In Guatemala, the United Fruit Company, which was an American company, had controlled the company through pliable dictators, basically arranging so that the leaders would give them favorable tax discounts or whatever, let them do whatever the hell they wanted.
Let them grow bananas and ship them back to the U.S., basically.
Take their resources at 0 pennies on the dollar if you want,
Probably.
and then ship them back to the U.S. In 1950, a young colonel named Arbenz was elected and decided that they wanted to control their own resources, much to the dismay of the American companies. They hired our good friend, Mr. Bernays. It was decided, along with President Eisenhower at the time, that they should topple this guy and maybe put in someone more friendly to them. And so the great smear campaign came where they started promoting that our Benz was actually a Soviet sympathizer.
Yeah, I think that was a popular smear back in those days. If anybody didn't agree with what the American government was doing, they'd smear them as a communist. It happens to this day.
So Bernays gets involved and he creates a fake independent news company called the Middle America Information Bureau. This sounds like something that would happen today.
Are you saying there was fake news back in the 50s?
Through this company, Bernays puts out a series of news articles that get published everywhere, claiming that if we don't stop this guy, the Russians are getting a foothold in Central America and will work their way up. Does it sound like a familiar refrain?
It sounds like the dominoes falling in Southeast Asia.
And if you look at the 1980s with all of the madness that happened in Central America with the CIA going in and whacking all sorts of leaders and putting in
Nicaragua, El Salvador. I always wondered what was going on.
Yeah. It all started with a banana, apparently.
Is there a Sigmund Freud connection there again between the banana, the cigarette, and the penis, Richard?
There just might be. They start the smear campaign, they take him out, and they put in whoever they want. And so the CIA is brought in to do this. And one of the CIA agents in charge is Howard Hunt, who famously is one of the Watergate burglars.
And who was rumored to have been in Dealey Plaza the day that John Kennedy was shot.
Our good friend Mr. Bush was there too.
Also famous for putting out cigarettes on his hand to impress people. A Howard Hunt party trick. He would finish smoking a cigarette and extinguish it on the palm of his hand to show how tough he was. I think that's an interesting footnote to history.
Picked up by every bad guy in a Hollywood movie, right?
Probably.
This was the thing, showing how tough they are.
So we're back in Guatemala. The bananas are flowing. Edward's got more money. Everything's happy.
So another one of Bernays' campaign successes, if you want, is the box cake. So the idea was you would take the powder, you would add water, put it into your mold, and you'd have a cake. The problem was housewives weren't buying it. And so Betty Crocker approached Bernays and said, what can we do? They looked at the problem and they said, okay, here it is. Women feel guilty for providing too easily a meal, or in this case, a dessert, to their husbands. So they came up with the solution of tell them to add an egg. So the original cakes would have had like an egg-like powder inside the cake. So they took that out and they told the company, just tell them to add an egg. So now the housewife buys a box mix, brings it home, puts it in a bowl, adds water, cracks an egg. Her own egg. Now she's contributing. She's making an effort and feels less guilty because now it feels like she actually makes the cake.
And the chicken's egg becomes a metaphor for her own egg that she's donating to her husband. Is that what they're saying?
I think Uncle Sigmund would agree.
Uncle Sigmund would agree. Yeah, so there's a whole reproductive thing mixed up in here. Yeah.
And it becomes a big success and takes off. And from there, Bernays is, at this point, he's not the only one. People have learned from this, and it becomes entrenched in American, I won't just say American advertising, but advertising.
Let's call it Western advertising. Yeah.
Western advertising and corporate culture. This is the way we sell things. We start to look at personalities, sell a personality, sell a lifestyle rather than a product.
And motivations and feelings. I think this is where we get the rise of the focus group. There was a gentleman there who pioneered the focus group whose name escapes me.
Gallup.
We've all heard of the Gallup poll, so Gallup is involved, another big name from the 20th century. So business has figured out that if you can figure out what makes people feel better and you can provide the feel good, then they're going to buy more of your product. And Edward Bernays' work begins to ramify in further ways as we get into the 60s, the golden age of advertising. It's called by some the age of Don Draper from the series Mad Men.
Yeah.
You see Don Draper, I mean, that's part of his brilliance is that he's talking to his clients about feelings and motivations and why people do things. And if we push this button, that'll happen. And you can tie it all back to Edward Bernays and prior that to Sigmund Freud.
And so at this point, psychoanalysis is making a big dent in America. You have a lot of psychoanalysts who are starting to set up, and you have a lot of celebrities who start to go see psychoanalysts because now we're talking about getting in touch with the inner self. And one of their early, not experiments, but forays into this would have been with soldiers just after World War II, talking to them about the trauma they went through during the war. There's an interview in the movie where you see the guy, they're asking asking about something. He goes, yes, I'm feeling, you would call this nostalgia, which is weird. It's the first time I heard it called that. But, it was often called shell shock, or today would be PTSD, or other terms as it evolves over the time.
I think it was President Truman, so he who succeeded Roosevelt, who inaugurated something like a committee on mental health. And this was brand new. People didn't talk about mental health. It remains a bit of a taboo today, you could say, but you really didn't talk about your mental health back then. So this was quite revolutionary. And again, it was trying to get at this thought, started by Freud, that there was maybe these seething unconscious emotions underneath most people's calm exteriors. How do we identify this potential danger to society? How do we control it? How do we prevent these people from going, what if they go berserk and we can't control them? They're working on it from that angle. It's good, but it's coming from that angle. They're afraid of the mob.
And this is where you have the interesting juxtaposition between Bernays and Freud, who's his uncle. His uncle is all about not controlling, but making sure that people live to a certain code of conduct to become a society. And Bernays says, okay, well, we know they have these inner emotions. How can we exploit them to sell them a product? The same concept, but taken two different ways. In the same way that when we looked at sell a product on one side of the ocean, enslave mankind on the other side. Psychoanalysis came into favor and then eventually fell out of favor after the death of Marilyn Monroe, who had been seeing a psychoanalyst.
Oh, is that so?
It kind of lost its stigma. A lot of stars and celebrities were going, and then Marilyn, who famously had gone because she was suffering from despair, actually moved in down the street from her psychoanalyst, and he kind of adopted her into his family to give her a family unit. He would play the father figure. There was his wife and the kids and whatever. Didn't work. She killed herself like a couple houses down from him. And that sent a little bit of a shockwave through society, and it kind of put a little, hold on, does this thing really work? And then came the reverberations from that, where you have scream therapy and all these kind of things of saying, well, we're not going to repress the feelings, we're going to go crazy. And you get the famous temper tantrum of the 60s. It's taken to the complete opposite swing of the pendulum.
That could be a whole other episode, but it's true, it all connects, because the kids who grew up in the 50s, the first teenagers who had some sort of prosperity and who could be marketed to, the baby boomers really rejected completely the conformist society of the 1950s, wanted nothing to do with it, wanted nothing to do with the fact that life had to be perfect, the picket fence, dad went to work, dad came home, dad always wore a suit, mom had on an apron. They rejected it completely and went slightly out of control with the help of lysergic acid diethylamide, which was being used by the psychoanalysts in the 50s to help a lot of Hollywood celebrities overcome their problems. There's a number of names there. All took LSD, acid, as it became known, to help them out of their various psychological issues. And that got a little bit out of control when Tim Leary on the West Coast, or on the East Coast rather, and Ken Kesey on the West Coast turned it into a thing. And we had all kinds of great music and hair and beads and patchouli, God knows what else, and Woodstock.
And advertising, and the people who controlled that, they followed it lockstep. Early on, you had your focus groups, you had your polls, and as society began to change, they realized that their polls were not targeting the audiences in the same way because they had identified them differently in the past. And now they realized, well, someone of a high income, in the past, they would have said, well, they tend to have these spending habits. And as society evolved, they realized they couldn't categorize that. So they started to develop a different style of polling.
So not categorized by income anymore.
No, now categorized by values and lifestyle. So the Stanford Research Institute out in, I think it's California, developed a series of questions that were based a lot more on feelings, the way you felt about certain situations or life, as opposed to specifically targeting products. They might say, well, how does this product make you feel? And they did this massive research and they started categorizing people in a different way that allowed them to predict and sell even more, even though the people had broken out of their very rigid ways and had gone to the expression of the self and wanted individualism. They were able to follow right along because they developed a tool that allowed them to follow that too. And were able to continue selling, and they're still doing it today.
Advertising and public relations, which are just two sides of the same coin, are nothing if not adaptable. I can remember very clearly the Just Do It campaign of Nike in the 1980s. I've worked in advertising to some extent across the course of my life. I'm somewhat familiar with the processes, but I do remember Just Do It. And I think what it was, I'm going to say this and I might be wrong, is it's the first time that they never actually mentioned the product. You saw people living the lifestyle the product could provide. In other words, if you get out there and wake up at 6 o'clock every morning, beat yourself in the ass and go running and do whatever, you will be this and they show you the person. And oh, by the way, they're wearing some sneakers and they just happen to have a Nike swoosh on them. That was a groundbreaker.
You can sell the lifestyle rather than the product. You get more of an emotional attachment to the product because now you want to be the guy or the girl in the video living that lifestyle. Think of when the iPod came out and they had those great commercials and you saw someone dancing and all you saw, the only thing you saw was the white cord of the headphones, right? And the product might have been mentioned at the end, but it was the music, it was a driving beat, it was colors, dancing. It made you want to go out and party.
That's a very good example. They weren't really talking about how good the product, what the frequency response was, or what the weight of it was, or anything. Just, this is what you get. I'm as susceptible to this type of marketing as anybody. We were talking about this earlier. I bought a particular camera 10 years ago, made by Fuji, for those camera enthusiasts out there, the Fuji X100S digital camera that looked like an old Leica. And I was completely sold on the look of this camera. I didn't need this camera at all. I had a camera, but I wanted this camera. I thought if I shoot with this camera, it's going to make me feel a certain way. And I even convinced myself that I was producing a certain type of photograph with this. And maybe that's true because it only had one lens. It had a fixed lens with a certain focal length. So maybe that's true. I was sold on this. I had to have this camera. I couldn't wait for this camera.
And it'll surprise no one to know that I have the same camera.
Is anybody out there surprised?
Probably not.
You said last week, lusting after computers. How much do we lust after stuff sometimes, right?
Exactly.
You just got to have it. Got to have this piece of technology. Got to have that piece of technology. If I could go back over the last 20 years and not purchase all the things I purchased that just because I wanted them, I'd have a lot more money. I can look around here and go, I didn't need that. I didn't need that. Why is everything in here stainless steel? Used to be Harvest Gold.
But your friend Eddie Bernays would say, if you didn't buy those products, would you be happier? Would you be living or would you be existing?
Yes, he would. I hope as this episode draws to a close, you can see the direct line between the hyper-commercialized, consumerized lifestyles we live today, where we're being bombarded with advertising messages all day long for stuff we don't need. There's a straight line you can draw back to Mr. Bernays in the 1920s and the rise of public relations and want-based advertising, focus groups a little bit later, polling, Mr. Gallup. This is the world we live in.
And we spoke a lot about the advertising side, but there's a whole portion of it that is on the political side
yes,
where
Richard.
Campaigns have been orchestrated to make us feel like campaigns of fear, to sell policing, to sell more weapons, to sell policies because they keep us in constant fear, whether it's invaded during the Cold War or if it's the Taliban or whoever you want to put a label as today's enemy. There's a fear that they're going to come here. And so we need Homeland Security. I mean, there was one of the greatest PR campaigns ever.
That's a big one.
They developed that one.
Homeland Security. I was uncomfortable with that from the concept, but I also didn't like the fact that the country was referring to itself as a homeland, because that to me harkens back to the fatherland, the motherland. It just didn't feel right to me. On the political side, I was watching a documentary a couple of years ago by a guy called John Pilger, an Australian, and he was talking about Obama and the election of Obama and how Obama was really a brand, very skilled politician, a hyper intelligent, a charming, good looking man with a great, charming, intelligent wife, great looking family. It was the brand that sold the country on the president because it was a little bit risky. He was a black guy, but he wasn't that black. And, it let everybody think they were moving the ball forward. I remember the excitement. I can remember watching him speak into teleprompters when he was elected. And I was thinking, don't let him get shot. I had this thought. I'm probably watching it. I don't know where I was, but don't let this man be shot because that's what the world needs now. And it was all about hope and change. Hope and change. Didn't really change anything.
Think of the poster. Yes, we can poster, the whole campaign, right? The whole poster
we can.
Done in that very colorful style, a very graphic art style poster of Obama to help sell. And as you said, as a brand.
I think that's happening right now with the UK with Rishi Sunak, their new prime minister. You've got a guy who is he's a handsome man, a well-dressed man, a well-spoken man, and a conservative, an arch-conservative in this case, not a liberal Democrat as Obama should have been. But I think the fact that he's Indian, there's an appearance of progressiveness happening there within the Conservative Party, which I guarantee would not typically encompass people of Rishi's background. And again, I don't care what his background is. I mean, I'm just looking at his politics, and I don't think they're going to get what they need right now, which is, in my opinion, a sharp shift back towards something that looks like the New Deal. I've laid my cards on the table, Richard. That's my New Deal.
That's your New Deal. So behind all of it, the grand puppet master, Edward Bernays.
Edward Bernays. Yeah. There's a couple of documentaries out there. Richard talked about the century of the self. You can find it on YouTube. It occasionally gets banned. I don't know why. We'll put a link down below or we'll list the title down below.
It's a short 4 hours.
Yeah, it's a short 4 hours. But it's super entertaining. And you also get to meet his weird, daughter, Anna? Sigmund Freud's daughter?
That's Sigmund Freud's daughter is mentioned in there.
Daughter Anna, who's an oddball of her own brand, caused her own kind of commotion. So totally worth watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, a bit different for us. I really enjoyed brainstorming it with Richard and pulling all this stuff together.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad it's over because now I can think happy thoughts again, hopefully.
I have to decide what I want next. What useless, unnecessary product or service I will buy.
Well, I've got the Amazon loaded up. We can have a look after.
Why don't we go get an ass waxing? Apparently those are popular now, I've heard.
Yes. I don't think I want to buy that kit on Amazon.
I'd rather have somebody else do that on me.
That's going to ruin my search history.
So have a great week.
Thanks, Dave.